Hello, everybody. We're talking today about the environment, but not just the environment in sort of the foreign policy ways we think about today. What we want to do is we want to talk about how did the environment become part of the foreign policy conversation, and whether you think the way it's done is a good idea or not. So that's gonna be the topic. So we're actually going to do this by looking pretty much at a speech that was written by this guy, or at least given. I don't know if it was written. I'm sure he wrote most of it, but he has people. That's Warren Christopher. He's the Secretary of State for Bill Clinton in Bill Clinton's first term in office. And he's going to give this speech. Well, let's just look at this for a second here. He's going to give this speech in 1996 at Stanford. We're just going to call it the Stanford speech here. But here's the goal of this speech, and you're going to watch this speech. It's a little older, the speech is, and honestly, Warren Christopher is not the most eloquent talker. He's not the most interesting talker. It's kind of like listening to like an old guy talk about things like banking regulations in a way. So you're going to have to pay some special attention in a way that you don't normally, I think. So I'm going to give you some things to look for that will help you sort of navigate this speech. And then afterwards, you're going to get to watch some speeches by Obama, who's a much better orator, and then Trump, who is just super interesting to watch some of the things he says and how he says it. All right. The goal of this speech, here's the goal. Persuade the American people that a healthy environment is crucial to national security. So let's just think about this for a second. Excuse me, it's not just about saying we should really focus on the environment. It's about helping the American people make the connection between healthy environment and a national security issue. So this is before, like Al Gore is in the White House as vice president right now, and I'm sure he played a role in this, but this is before Al Gore does An Inconvenient Truth, and before America really is talking about things like climate change. Europe's kind of talking about these things quite a bit, but the United States is not talking about this. The United States is talking about local environmental cleanup. So in Nixon years, one of the big environmental projects was this thing called the Superfund, which was meant to clean up American, garbage spills and dumps and things like that, polluted waters. And the United States had done a pretty good job by the 90s of sort of cleaning up its own mess. But the global conversation about the environment was not a thing in the United States at this point. And that's what Christopher's going to do. He's going to essentially say, this thing that we've never really talked about before, healthy environment, not just in the United States but around the world, is crucial to national security. Like, remember how we just fought this Cold War? Okay, that was national security. Now, healthy environment is national security as well. In the same way you might say, they don't actually use this terminology, but for example, Nixon used the war on drugs or the war on poverty, or I guess Reagan did war on drugs, Nixon did war on poverty. This is sort of a war on unhealthy environment, but they never use that terminology because it's super weird. Again, the context for this is the Cold War is over. Remember we talked about this a little bit ago when we talked about Clinton, is that with the Cold War over, the United States didn't really know who the enemy was. Was it China? Is it Islamic, fundamentalism? Nobody really knew. We saw that Robert Kaplan article or thing about the coming anarchy, which talked about sort of non-state actors being the new threat. You have Fukuyama, who's talking about the end of history, like we're good, everything's solid. So this is in that context. It's only a few years after the end of the Cold War. There is no enemy threatening the U.S., and U.S. foreign policy is definitely searching for direction. Is this the direction? Now, what we know, here's the thing we know, is that this, even though Warren Christopher says this should be policy of the United States, he is out of office. Al Gore doesn't have a very loud voice, and Bill Clinton had other things going on. It never really became a key element. The environment did not become a key element of U.S. foreign policy until probably Barack Obama. If not, we say the Congress sort of brought it in before that. But this is sort of the first stab at it. So before I have you watch the speech, I'm just going to give you a little context. The main point, again, if the goal is persuading Americans that the healthy environment is crucial to national security, Like, here's the deal. You have this entire population of the United States who is not at the point where climate change is not a thing. Global warming is not really a term that's being thrown around quite a bit yet. And so why should we care about this stuff? We've already kind of cleaned up our lakes. We're good. So this is how he's going to lay it out, and then I'll let you guys watch the speech. Our global interests, U.S. global interests, are linked to how we manage the Earth's natural resources. So we haven't really talked about this at all, but the UN had been talking about these things. They've been talking about sustainable development, things like that. There was already talks about population pressures. So this is in that sort of way of thinking. But the United States has really always sort of taken the tack on these things. If there's a problem, we've got technology and a strong economy and human innovation, and we'll be able to solve whatever problem you throw at us. But as time is going on here, and the point that Christopher's going to make is, that's great, and we'll do pretty good, but we can't do that forever. A lot of these things transcend borders, so it's not whether it's happening in the United States or not, it can drift over into the United States, or probably more importantly, drift over into things of our allies, cause problems in our allies, and then we'll have to do something about it. It can affect our health, our prosperity, our jobs. I mean, it is still, globalization is a thing, and if the marketplaces around the world go down, so does U.S. economy. And then it's also critical to the political economic stability of the world. The United States is the superpower in the world. We would like to keep it that way. If there are these environmental problems around the world, that could cause destabilization in all these areas, which could threaten our position in the world. And let me just give you some idea here. Again, we're not really talking about climate change so much. That's going to be that's sort of a growing idea at this point, but not really the one that's dominant. It's going to be things like water scarcity. So, for example, if there's water scarcity, let's say in the Middle East, will states just say, well, if there's no more water, I guess we're done, or will they fight wars over the water? And will that entangle the United States to come to the rescue of, say, Israel, or to protect our oil interests or something like that? If there is, again, not global climate change, but if there's desertification in some areas where some places are being turned into deserts, that can create refugees leaving those areas, which can then the refugees can spread sort of economic problems, political problems, and that can lead to wars down the road that the United States is going to get involved in. So bottom line, again, these are not the only issues, but we're not talking about climate change so much, we're talking about all these other environmental issues that could destabilize what's going on. These are not exactly, the way that Christopher's talking about this, these are not exactly catastrophic things like we talk about climate change today. They're just things that could create problems for the United States in a world where we don't really know what the next problem is. So that's kind of the way to think about this. Population growth is increasing this pressure. And so this is going to be the thing that I do want you to really look for in this, how he sells this. This should be a part of U.S. foreign policy and, if needed, U.S. military policy, something that we call securitization. Securitization means you take something and you turn it into a national security issue. Probably the best example, if you've been following the news at all right now, is how Donald Trump talks about the wall between the U.S. and Mexico. If it's just a wall to contain migration and more, that's actually more of an economic problem more than anything else, because you're trying to control wages and you're trying to control the movement of workers and things like that. So that's an economic problem. But if you start to say, well, they're bringing threats across the border with them, it's a threat to national security if we don't build this wall, now all of a sudden it's a securitized issue. And what's important about this is, if I securitize an issue, if I call it a war issue or a security issue, it does a couple things. It takes on a higher level of significance. So if I call this like war on drugs, it's not just a problem with your kids. Like, this is something we need to fight against, and if necessary, even use our military strength against. which is exactly what happens in the 1980s when we send troops down into South America to fight the drug trade. And that's the kind of idea here, is on the one hand, you get way more attention on it, which again, if you're a green person, if you like environmental policy, this is good. More people are going to pay attention. There's going to be more U.S. resources devoted to this. But the downside is, if you securitize it or militarize it, how does that change how you view environmental policy, how you, I guess you could say, fight environmental degradation? Those are the sorts of things. So look for this idea here, turning this into a security issue. That's really what I want you to be thinking about while you're watching this video. How does Warren Christopher, what sort of approach does he talk about? And I also want you to remember while you're watching this that climate change is not an issue at this point. We're not talking about catastrophic change. We're just talking about sort of protecting the world as it is. How does Christopher sell this to the American people? And is it something that you would buy? Not knowing about climate change today, but is it something that if you were watching in 1996, would you buy this argument? So watch the video, watch this speech, and I'll see you back here and we'll walk through some pieces of it.